He fired me in the hallway 3 days before my bonus was scheduled to clear. There was no meeting room, no calendar invite, and no warning. Just the long stretch of polished floor outside the executive offices and people slowing their steps without turning their heads. He smiled while he did it, like this was a clean transaction, and said it was just business. The words landed flat, rehearsed until they sounded harmless. He said my name quickly, Corwin Hale, like he wanted the moment finished. He told me operations were being restructured and my role was no longer required. I opened my mouth to respond, but he lifted one finger and kept talking. He said the company was moving fast and tough decisions had to be made to protect the merger. His eyes drifted to his watch, then back to my face, then to his watch again. He was late for something that mattered more than me. That was when the timing fully registered. 3 days. Not next week. Not end of quarter. 3 days before my bonus cleared. Everyone in leadership knew that date. I had signed the confirmation myself. He stepped back when he finished, already disengaging, already moving on. No anger. No hesitation. That calm told me everything. This wasn't sudden. It wasn't emotional. It was planned, careful, and deliberate. My bonus confirmation email was still open on my phone when HR disabled my access. 1 second I was reading the approval notice. The next, the screen refreshed and everything logged out at once. Email. Systems. Dashboards. A woman from HR said my name softly and asked for my badge and laptop. Her eyes stayed on the carpet as if eye contact might make this harder. 2 security staff appeared behind her, not aggressive, just present, like they had rehearsed this walk. People nearby stared at their screens harder than necessary, fingers moving without purpose. I handed over my badge and felt how light it was in my palm. Years of work reduced to plastic and a thin strip of metal. As we walked toward the elevator, my phone vibrated. The bonus email refreshed again. Approved. Pending payout. Scheduled for Friday morning. I almost laughed. The timing was too exact to be accidental. The elevator doors opened and no one said goodbye. Not because they didn't care, but because caring felt risky. I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. Calm face. Straight shoulders. Steady hands. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. I placed the box in my car and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The silence pressed in, heavy but honest. I stayed in my car longer than I needed to, replaying his voice over and over. Just business. He said it like it explained everything. Like it erased loyalty, effort, and promises. He never let me speak. Every time I tried, he talked faster, louder, pushing the moment forward. He kept tapping his watch, like I was an obstacle he needed to clear before his next meeting. That's when I realized he wasn't nervous or conflicted. He was impatient. Firing me was a task wedged between calendar blocks. I thought about the nights I stayed late to keep operations stable while others went home. The weekends spent fixing problems no one else understood. The calls I answered because I was the only one who could. Anger came later. First came clarity. This wasn't personal, but it wasn't neutral either. It was deliberate. The timing proved that. They waited until every critical piece depended on my work, then removed me before the money cleared. I started the engine and drove slowly, paying attention to every thought instead of fighting them. I didn't shout. I didn't hit the steering wheel. I observed. When people show you who they are, the smartest move is to listen without reacting. They recruited me during a breakdown. Systems were failing across departments. Vendors were threatening penalties. Regulators were asking questions that exposed how fragile things really were. I remember the call clearly. Calm voice. Urgent tone. They said they needed someone steady, someone who could restore order without noise or ego. They promised stability and long-term thinking. They talked about respect for experience and clear accountability. Bonuses were explained carefully. Guaranteed if targets were hit. In writing. I read the contract twice before signing. I hit every target. I documented every milestone. When others panicked, I built structure. When deadlines slipped, I fixed the process instead of assigning blame. The board praised the turnaround. The CEO shook my hand and said loyalty mattered here. He said people were valued. I believed him. 4 years, that belief held. Then his son appeared, and the temperature inside the company changed. Suddenly, experience was slow. Caution became fear. Stability was labeled resistance. I didn't push back right away. I watched. I listened. Power behaves differently when it's inherited instead of earned, and I needed to understand how it moved before responding. The CEO's son arrived one morning with a new title and loud confidence. Vice President. He introduced himself like everyone already knew him. Nobody remembered approving the role, but nobody questioned it either. He spoke in meetings like he was testing lines he practiced alone. He asked questions that revealed how little he understood the systems beneath him. When corrected, he smiled and said he liked disruption. At first, he sat quietly and observed. Then he started interrupting late in meetings, when people were tired. He questioned decisions that had already been validated months earlier. He called experience outdated and caution a lack of vision. People nodded instead of pushing back. Power changes how rooms behave. I watched carefully. He wanted to leave a mark fast. The merger deadline became his obsession. He talked about optics more than outcomes, perception more than reality. He liked shortcuts because they sounded bold. I started documenting everything quietly. Not out of fear but out of habit. Good operations leave a trail. I noticed how often warnings were dismissed and how quickly people stopped giving them. He began undoing processes I built, calling them slow and heavy. He pushed risky shortcuts to impress merger partners watching from a distance. I warned him about regulatory exposure. He waved it away and said we would clean it up later. Later never comes in mergers. He replaced trusted vendors with cheaper names that hadn't been tested at scale. He skipped verification steps to save time. Every risk I flagged was dismissed as negativity. He wanted speed. He wanted praise. He wanted results without understanding cost. I documented changes carefully. Dates. Decisions. Names. Not because I planned revenge, but because good systems require records. Memory fails. Documentation doesn't. I noticed how often he joked about my bonus in side conversations, calling experience expensive. I didn't respond. I focused on keeping things stable despite the changes. Deep down, I sensed something was being positioned. You don't remove safeguards unless you believe consequences won't reach you. The bonus wasn't just money. It was tied directly to closing the merger cleanly. Operational stability. Compliance confirmation. 0 exceptions. That responsibility was mine. My signature was required, and everyone knew it. Firing me days before payout removed the obligation to pay. Simple math. Clean ledger. He saved the company money and looked decisive doing it. I wondered how long he had planned it. Weeks. Months. Long enough to wait until everything depended on me. HR sent the termination letter that night. Polished and neutral. It listed dates and access changes. It never mentioned the bonus. Not once. As if omission made it disappear. I read it slowly, then opened my employment agreement from years earlier. Some clauses sit quietly until the moment they matter. This one mattered more than they realized. The contract required continuity certification before merger completion. Specific language. No substitutes. Department heads had to confirm stability personally. My name was still listed as the responsible signer. Termination did not remove that responsibility without documented transition. That hadn't happened. 2 critical confirmations still required my signature. Operational continuity and regulatory readiness. Both were scheduled for the following week. Both reference systems only I validated. My replacement didn't have clearance yet. He didn't have access either. The oversight was obvious once you looked for it. They moved fast, but not carefully. Speed creates blind spots. I closed the file and turned off my phone. I didn't need to rush. They already had. That night, I slept better than I expected. Not because I felt calm, but because my thoughts were finally ordered. In the morning, I reread my contract slowly, with coffee and patience. Every word mattered. This wasn't about emotion. It was about language. The clause on continuity certification was clear and unambiguous. Before merger completion, department heads were required to certify operational stability. No substitute language. No exceptions. My name was listed. I checked the amendment history. Nothing had changed. Termination alone did not remove that responsibility. Only a documented transition did. There was no transition. I didn't call anyone. I didn't hint or threaten. I sent one short message to legal. I am reviewing my separation agreement with counsel. That was it. No accusations. No explanations. Just enough to pause momentum. Then I waited. Silence has weight when deadlines are near. I spent the rest of the morning doing normal things. Laundry. Groceries. A walk. The world didn't end because I was fired. That mattered. When your life stays stable, it's easier to think clearly while others rush. The first call came at 8 the next morning. A project manager I had worked with for years. His voice was tight, controlled, careful. He said they needed my approval for a compliance checkpoint tied to the merger timeline. The deadline was that afternoon. Regulators were waiting. I listened without interrupting. I could hear the pressure in his breathing, the way he chose each word. When he finished, I spoke slowly and evenly. I am no longer authorized to sign anything. There was a pause. Then silence. Then a sharp inhale. He asked if anyone else could approve it. I said the certification required my signature until transition was documented. We ended the call politely. 5 minutes later, another number rang. I let it ring. 10 minutes later, a message appeared asking me to call urgently. I didn't. I made coffee instead. Routine keeps panic from spreading. I knew more calls would come. Systems don't fail all at once. They fail one dependency at a time. Corporate legal called just before noon. The tone was different from before. Slower. More careful. They asked if I would consider a short-term consulting arrangement to bridge the gap. Just a few days, they said. I asked for details in writing. There was hesitation on the line. I declined verbally and ended the call. Then I sent one email suggesting they review the merger timeline without my certifications. No sarcasm. No emotion. Facts only. Silence followed. Silence is loud when people expect answers. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt alignment. This was playing out exactly as the structure allowed. I spent the afternoon reading and organizing my files, not because I planned to send them, but because order matters. When you're calm, you don't rush to prove anything. You let others discover what they need on their own. The third call came late that afternoon. The CEO himself. His voice was warm but measured, the way it always was when he wanted cooperation. He asked what it would take to smooth things over. I reminded him that his son made it clear I was no longer needed. I repeated the phrase back to him. Just business. There was a long pause. Families complicate leadership. He said he wanted to reset the situation. I said resets only work when terms are clear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply stated what the contract required. Written agreement. Limited scope. Public acknowledgement of my role. No informal favors. He agreed without negotiating. That was the moment I knew the balance had shifted. When people stop pushing back, they have already accepted reality. We ended the call quietly. No apologies. No anger. Power rarely announces itself when it moves. It simply changes who is asking and who is deciding. The next morning, regulators requested documentation. Files only I prepared. Notes only I validated. Questions only I answered before. At first, deadlines slipped quietly. Then they slipped publicly. Confident updates turned vague. Investor calls increased. Statements stalled. The merger press tour paused. Everyone waited for signatures that didn't come. They waited for me. I watched from a distance, not with excitement, but with understanding. Operations isn't about control. It's about dependency. Remove one piece, and the whole structure adjusts. By mid-morning, messages started coming from people who hadn't spoken to me in months. Short, careful notes. Asking if I was okay. Asking if I had time. I replied politely but vaguely. I wasn't hiding. I was waiting. Waiting is a skill most people never learn. By noon, the atmosphere inside the company had shifted. Meetings were delayed without explanation. Calendar invites disappeared and reappeared with fewer names. People who usually spoke fast and loud began choosing their words carefully. I noticed it even without being there. Former colleagues sent messages apologizing for bothering me. I replied calmly. The merger clock kept moving forward, and every hour without confirmation mattered. Silence does not calm investors. It unsettles them. I imagined conference rooms where people stared at timelines that no longer lined up. I imagined the CEO's son insisting everything was fine while others avoided eye contact. I didn't feel excitement. I felt recognition. Systems behave exactly as designed. When you remove structure and ignore warnings, delay becomes inevitable. The company wasn't collapsing. It was hesitating. And hesitation, during a merger, is often worse than failure. Late that evening, corporate legal emailed again. The message was longer and noticeably more careful. They acknowledged my certifications were still required under the merger agreement. They proposed a revised consulting offer and framed it as a temporary bridge. I read it slowly. The language was respectful but incomplete. It still avoided public acknowledgement of my role. It still suggested I was helping them rather than fulfilling a documented requirement. I replied with a short message. I am open to consulting under written terms only. Scope limited. Duration fixed. Public acknowledgement required. I didn't explain why. I didn't argue. When leverage is real, explanations are unnecessary. The response came back within 10 minutes. Agreement pending executive approval. That was new. Before, everything had been filtered through policy. Now it was filtered through urgency. I closed my laptop and stepped outside. The air was cool and steady. Panic has a sound. Calm does not. The CEO called again the next morning. His voice was still calm, but the confidence behind it had shifted. He said the merger was at risk. He said regulators were asking questions only I could answer. He said investors were uneasy. Then he asked what it would take to move forward quickly. I reminded him that his son fired me and made it clear I was no longer needed. I repeated his words back to him. Just business. There was a pause long enough to feel deliberate. He said he wanted to move on correctly. I repeated my terms. Written agreement. Limited scope. Public acknowledgement. No exceptions. He agreed immediately. That was the moment the conversation ended. Not with tension, but with clarity. When decisions are finally aligned with reality, everything else becomes simple. The revised agreement arrived less than an hour later. It was clean and direct, without clever language or hidden timelines. My full bonus was included without hesitation, listed clearly and scheduled for immediate payout. Additional compensation reflected the consulting scope, limited and defined. Public acknowledgement of my role appeared in plain language, not buried in footnotes. I read every line slowly. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. This document told the truth of the situation. I signed and returned it, then set my phone down. Almost immediately, messages began arriving. Project managers. Compliance leads. Legal staff. The same people who had avoided eye contact days earlier were suddenly careful and respectful. I scheduled confirmations methodically, one by one. I didn't rush. I didn't improvise. Each document was reviewed in order. Each system was verified. Each answer was written and logged. Panic creates mistakes. Process prevents them. By the end of the day, regulators had the first set of confirmations. Investors received updated guidance. The merger timeline restarted, slower but steadier. Inside the company, the mood shifted. People noticed who was suddenly essential and who no longer drove the room. Work resumed with a different rhythm. Meetings were shorter and quieter. Questions were specific. Assumptions were challenged before decisions were made. I joined only the calls required by the agreement. Nothing more. I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, I referenced documentation and dates, not opinions. The systems responded the way they always had when treated with care. Risks that had been ignored were addressed. Vendors were reviewed. Verification steps were restored. Regulators asked follow-up questions, and the answers held. Investors stopped pressing for reassurance and started asking for timelines again. The change was subtle but real. Confidence returned without noise. I could feel it in the way emails were written, in the way agendas were shared ahead of time. Structure does that. It removes the need for performance. The company wasn't stronger than before. It was steadier. That mattered more. I stayed professional and neutral. I didn't revisit old arguments or remind anyone of warnings they dismissed. The work spoke on its own. That was enough. As the days passed, the internal narrative shifted quietly. People referenced earlier decisions without naming who made them. Conversations focused on process instead of personalities. Shortcuts stopped being praised. Caution stopped being mocked. I noticed the CEO's son attended fewer meetings. When he did attend, he spoke less and listened more. Accountability doesn't arrive with confrontation. It settles gradually as facts replace assumptions. Documentation became central again. Emails mattered. Decision logs mattered. The record spoke for itself. Patterns became impossible to ignore. Processes dismantled without replacement. Risks accepted without review. Warnings dismissed because they were inconvenient. No one needed to accuse him directly. Operations doesn't argue. It records. When outcomes change, people go looking for causes. They rarely like what they find, but they can't deny it. The merger continued forward, not with excitement, but with focus. That focus told me more than any apology ever could. By the time the merger reached its final phase, confidence had returned, but it felt different. Quieter. Less performative. The company stopped bragging and started explaining. Investor updates became factual and measured. Regulators signed off in stages, each approval earned instead of assumed. I completed the final confirmation late on a Thursday afternoon and sent a short notice to legal. All required certifications completed. I closed my laptop and felt a sense of completion settle in. Not relief. Completion. Relief fades quickly. Completion stays. I returned. Temporary access credentials the next morning without ceremony. No escort. No tension. Just space. That afternoon, I took a long walk and let the remaining weight leave my shoulders. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about what comes next when you refuse to trade standards for comfort. The future felt open in a way it hadn't in years. The following week, an internal update circulated. It was brief and carefully written. The CEO's son would be stepping back from day-to-day operations to focus on broader initiatives. No explanation. No ceremony. Just a change in reporting lines. People noticed immediately. Conversations shifted. Names stopped being mentioned. Silence filled the space where confidence once sat. Nobody celebrated. Nobody needed to. Consequences don't require applause. They require alignment between decisions and outcomes. I received a message from the CEO thanking me for my professionalism during a difficult period. I replied politely and without emotion. Professional relationships end the same way they operate. Clean or messy. This one ended cleanly. I didn't feel pride. I felt calm. Calm is earned when you don't compromise yourself to win. My bonus cleared on Friday morning, exactly as scheduled years earlier. I checked the deposit once and closed the app. Money arrives quietly when it's earned. I didn't feel excitement. I felt validation. Not because of the amount, but because the principle held. Contracts mattered. Work mattered. Process mattered. I sent one final email confirming the conclusion of my consulting engagement. Then I archived the thread. People expect dramatic endings to stories like this. There weren't any. Just quiet resolution. I reviewed opportunities without urgency. When you've seen how quickly confidence can fail, patience becomes easier. I wasn't interested in noise anymore. I was interested in structure, clarity, and accountability. The things that hold when pressure comes. Weeks passed. The merger closed fully. Press releases described it as a success built on strong operational discipline. I noticed my role mentioned accurately. Not exaggerated. Not minimized. Accurate. That mattered more than praise. Former colleagues reached out to check in. Some apologized quietly for staying silent earlier. I accepted without judgment. People protect themselves when power feels unstable. I understood that. I didn't carry resentment forward. Resentment ties you to places you've already left. I focused on what I had learned. When people rush to look decisive, they often create the conditions for delay. When systems are respected, momentum follows naturally. Those lessons stayed with me as I considered next steps. I saw the CEO's son once after everything settled. It was brief and public. We nodded to each other. No words were exchanged. None were needed. He looked smaller, not physically, but structurally. Authority had moved away from him, and without it, his confidence had nothing to stand on. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt understanding. Authority without foundation always collapses eventually. It isn't personal. It's structural. I wished him no harm. I also wished him no influence over systems he didn't understand. Both felt reasonable. We walked in opposite directions and didn't look back. That felt right. Time created distance, and distance created perspective. Looking back, I didn't regret waiting. I didn't regret refusing to explain myself when explanation wasn't required. When you rush to justify your worth, you teach people they're allowed to question it. I let the work speak. I let the process hold. I let silence do what noise never could. Strength is often mistaken for volume. In reality, strength is steady. It's knowing when to act and when to wait. I walked away with my bonus, my record, and my principles intact. The company learned something valuable, even if they never said it out loud. Loyalty isn't leverage. It's trust, and trust has limits. When people treat loyalty as something to exploit, systems eventually respond. I moved forward without bitterness, calm and unbothered, knowing I did the work the right way and left without compromising who I am.